All right, friends, we're back to cover Venus in another episode. This one is about Venus and the sign of Aries. If you have this in your birth chart as a birth signature, this video will apply. And it also applies to the current transit of 2025, where Venus is going to station in the sign of Aries at 10 degrees, move backwards into Pisces, and then forward to cover its shadow degrees until it passes that 10-degree mark, and eventually it makes it back to its lovely home of Taurus. And if you guys are interested, go back to my last 4 videos. I've talked extensively about Venus in the sign of Pisces and this retrograde. So we're going to shift our focus mostly on Venus and the sign of Aries. And with that said, let us begin. All right, so I'm just going to very quickly go through some of the significations and symbols related to Venus and the sign of Aries, so you guys get a feel for why I'm going to make the first statement that I'm going to make, that Venus in the sign of Aries has a lot of dissonance. And you'll see from the symbols, but I'll explain them as we go along. So let's start with Venus, and I'll put her on the side of the screen here. Venus represents femininity. It's the feminine principle, so it's inward moving and it's receptive. The moon has a similar quality. Connections and unions, such as love and marriage, is about cooperation. Venus is all about cooperation. I mean, when we think about Venus's other sign, the sign of Libra, that's what it's all about. And then in the sign of Taurus, Venus also has this kind of resonance when it's with its own sign, because itself is related to loyalty, fidelity, stability. Venus also represents beauty and beautiful things, objects of wealth. It represents art and learning the skill sets to be artistic. Venus is about health, fertility, sensual pleasures. So these are some of the significations of Venus. Now, when we go to the sign of Aries, pay attention. It's almost like flipping something on its head suddenly. So Venus was about femininity and the feminine principle right away. Aries is about masculinity and the masculine principle. And in fact, we could say the sign of Aries, from all the 3 fire signs, which are Leo and Sag also, this is the hyper-masculine sign from all of them. So it's self-moving. It's about self-determination. Remember, Venus was about cooperation. Aries is inceptive, initiative. It's about energy and being energetic, penetrative. It's about individuality. It's very self-oriented, the sign of Aries. And in this way, it's about independence, self-reliance, strength, bravery, adventure, and passion. So almost all of it is in some kind of a dissonance. We will see that there will be some connections, and there are life lessons that we can learn throughout a lifetime because we have this signature in our chart, or through this transit. But let's start with describing what some of this dissonance is about when we get Venus in the sign of Aries. One of the first things to remember, Venus, the goddess of love, is going to a sign that belongs to Mars, the god of war. And there's going to be a natural tension here, because if you think about what love is about connection and merging. It's coming together this way. What is Mars generally trying to do? It's taking out his sword, sever and cut things, create disconnection. So right off the bat, we have a strong dissonance at the core root of their objective. And then we can take that notion of masculine and feminine as a kind of a prominent dissonance between these 2 energies melding and mixing, because the feminine principle represents receptivity, connection, and cooperation. And Mars, on the other hand, wants to be inceptive, initiating, forward-moving. It's about individuality, self-determination, self-assertion, and always prioritizing action to move forward and to assert itself rather than cooperate with other people. This fundamental contrast is creating a dissonance. It's like being in a relationship where your value system is very different than your partner. And at every point, whatever that comes out, because those underlying values are different, there's conflict and tension between this couple, right? Venus is keep telling Mars, come on, let's compromise and let's cooperate. Let's somehow merge together. And Mars's drive can't hear this. It's about, I want to be independent. I need to assert myself in this situation. So it creates dissonance and conflict. And then their motion types are very different. always emphasizing on planets having a type of emotion because it allows us to conceptualize their actions or what it is that they're trying to do. That receptivity of Venus, because of being of that feminine principle, is inward moving. And Venus has this kind of a magnetic, attractive thing to it that can stand there passively and it can attract things to itself. And by the virtue of this attracting, establishing connections, unions, merging, it's doing all of this. And this is, if you go back to the Pisces videos, this is one of the reasons why Venus is exalted in the sign of Pisces. It goes into Pisces, everything's merging already, and Venus as this field of interaction that is about magnetism and attraction, everything naturally comes together and merges. But when it comes into the sign of Aries, into Mars's sign, Mars doesn't stand still, especially the sign of Aries. It's constant forward moving, so its motion's outwards, it's inceptive, it's igniting, it's initiating, and it's trying to create conquest. So Venus is receptively waiting for things to come to it, and the sign of Aries is like, I need to go out and conquer that thing. Mars also has this nature. So in some ways, we can see that Venus here is trying to create sustainability in relationship, like that thing of loyalty and fidelity, whereas Mars has this drive for pursuit, and not to mention the impulse to separate and to assert its own freedom and individuality at all times. So again, a huge dissonance between these two energies. And then we can look at how Venus is so enduring and Mars has this passionate quality, which this can actually become a kind of a resonance. But there's some degree of disconnect and tension here too, because Venus is constantly emphasizing that let's harmonize, let's cooperate, let's make something beautiful together. And Mars's dynamic energy, which is infused in the sign of Aries, and Aries has the same quality, is about let's go on an adventure, let's take a risk, let's put it all on the line. Through that passion and that fire that's in it, it's just constantly prioritizing immediate action. And if you think about it, if you're constantly prioritizing immediate action, you're also looking for immediate gratification. Whereas Venus has that sense of sustainability to it. It can endure. You know, we see a lot of this in the sign of Taurus in terms of Venus's qualities. So that spontaneity and the risk-taking thing that's in Aries, it rubs Venus the wrong way. So it gets the script from Aries and it's like, wow, this is so against my own nature. I don't even know what to do with this. And then there's another thing too that's difficult here is that Venus is constantly prioritizing union and relationships, love. That's what it's about. That's its own inherent script in its own hand about what itself is. And it comes to a sign that is very individualistic and it's very independent. And Aries sign is constantly like, I need to be self-reliant. Whereas Venus is constantly asking to do things together. So the script is forcing Venus to compromise its cooperative and compromising nature to just be in the pursuit, to be self-reliant. This is a difficult thing to do for Venus in the sign of Aries. And then not to mention the sign of Aries, because the ruler is Mars, it can become competitive even in relationships, where Venus is like, come on, babe, we'll do it together. Mars is like, no, Aries is like, I'll do it myself. So again, great contrast in terms of value systems and in terms of how they approach life and how to proceed in life. And another thing worth remembering, Venus is about beauty, like jewelry, makeup. I mean, we can think about these things in terms of something that's superficial, but is an act of adornment, is an act of care, is an act of love. And on a deeper level, when we think about Venus being related to arts, and we generally think arts as something that's beautiful, it's because of the proportion, the harmonizing factors in that composition that's giving rise to something that we perceive as beauty. Mars, on the other hand, by its own very nature, is very simplistic. Mars is just like go from point A to B, and its own sign has this kind of a feel too. So it's like that soldier who will be happy with a can of beans over fire and just eating it out of that can, even with its own hand. It's a little bit savage in that way. Whereas Venus is just wants to have a bit of etiquette and it wants to express its sense of beauty. And it comes into a sign that's acting like this. So again, it's going to become very off script for Venus. So I just wanted to bring some of the dissonance into your attention, but we're not done yet because Venus in the sign of Pisces, it's in its exaltation. In the sign of Aries, Venus is in its fall. I mean, opposing the sign of Aries is Libra, which is Venus's actual sign. So it's almost as if Venus is very far from home. It's like being on the opposite side of Earth, where home is. And it's in an environment that also doesn't support it. That's why I started talking about some of the dissonance between between Venus and the sign of Aries. So Venus is not well supported in the sign of Aries. And this fall in some traditions is called as a detriment, or the planet being in exile. And it's simply because it's in exile, because it's opposite of its own domicile, is opposite of its own home in the sign of Aries. Libra is its own home. And let's just consider this for a second. When Venus is at home in the sign of Libra, opposing the sign of Aries, Venus can establish harmony, balance, relationships, cooperation, and it has a lot of diplomacy when it's in the sign of Libra. And that's the way it wants to be. That's what Venus is about. It complements Venus in terms of how it wants to be beautiful and to create beautiful things, to be fair, and to create connections and unions. And then when it comes into the sign of Aries, where it's in its exile or fall, the sign is asking it, be assertive, be an individual, be action-oriented, be self-asserting. And it's just, these are not the natural tendencies. You know, there's a selfish orientation in the sign of Aries in some ways. We're supposed to take care of our own. We're supposed to pull ourselves up by our own bootstrap, and it's for ourselves. And this concept is foreign to Venus. In many ways, Venus would perceive the sign of Aries as being over-aggressive. I mean, that thrill-seeking aspect of Aries is not something that resonates with the nature of Venus. So again, we have to take into consideration that Venus is in its fall. And the next topic that we have to consider when we talk about Venus in the sign of Aries is related to the cardinal nature of Aries. I'm going to take a short break. I'll be right back. Okay, guys, I'm back. Back to the cardinal thing. And in that short break, I was thinking, share a little bit of a personal story. I don't have Venus in Aries. My Venus is in Taurus, but I have Moon in the sign of Aries. And in some ways, there's some similarities because both Venus and Moon are the feminine principles. And ever since I was a child, I had this deep desire to one day feel just comfortable. There's no comfort in some ways with Moon in Aries. And it's related to this cardinal aspect of the sign. Like when I wake up in the morning, I know I'm going to be home all day. I will look exactly as I look right now. It's always like ready to go. There's this thought that I always need to be ready to go. There's always this thought of what's the next thing I have to do. So just to be like in my PJs and just chill and wear big socks and put a big blanket over me, it doesn't feel right because this feminine principle, the moon, the mind, is forced to almost be like a soldier, just erect like this and ready to take the orders of the day. And that cardinal aspect of the sign of Aries is creating this feeling, as I just said. And like Libra is a cardinal sign too, but it's going to have a different kind of initiating qualities than Aries, this action-oriented sign. The sign of Aries is the biggest initiating sign of all the 12 signs. It's all about let's go now, let's do it. There's a sense of impulsivity to Aries because of this. So Aries is characterized by action and to just set new things into motion constantly. Aries is like a sprinter who just sprints full speed, needs to stop for a second because it does burn itself out, and then doof, another spurt. That's how it's constantly initiating something new. Cardinal signs in general want to initiate motion and movement to a new direction, but Aries really takes us over the top. So its motion is very dynamic, it's bold, it's energetic, and it just wants to constantly be ignited. It's like a burst of energy forth. Think about it. The sign of Aries falls into spring, right? Think about spring. It's like everything's dead right before it. And then suddenly you come out one morning and a bunch of trees have blossomed back into life. That bursting forth and initiating a new season is very much related to how Aries functions. So it's got an energetic drive behind it. It's self-determined, self-initiated, it's independent, and it just wants to jump in head first, like the ram. You know, the ram's always leading with its head to move forward. That's the kind of motion and the new initiation and new beginning that Aries is trying to create. So when Venus comes into the sign of Aries, that's the script it gets. And if you think about it, when we want to harmonize with other people and when we're cooperating with them, it takes time. It takes a lot of back and forth. Take 2 steps forward, take 1 step back, go right, go left. Aries is like forward. This is her objective. That's the way we're moving. So Venus's script is that you have to be initiating. And as I was saying earlier, Venus has that receptive feel where it can actually stand still, can even be a little bit passive, and it's attracting things to itself. It's not a sprinter, it's not a runner. And then suddenly the script is like, be action oriented, be proactive, act now. And another thing, Venus is constantly relying on sensual intuition almost, you know, feminine receptive principles, or relying on feelings and emotions to feel things out. And then here the script is like, you got to be vigorous. You just act and then you figure it out through the action. This is a contradiction for this planet. It makes Venus lose its sense of patience almost. The kind of patience that it needed to exert to see what it can attract to itself. Now it's got to go into pursuit of getting it for itself. So the role is inherently uncomfortable. And the sign of Aries, as I was saying, is very quick. Everything's just quick moving. So Venus, the planet that's about creativity and beauty, when we insert the idea of quickness, it's not for Venus to create some lasting result, unions and connections anymore. It becomes about gratification. It takes away that pleasure and that comfort that Venus would want to experience here. There's a thing about beauty, you know, we see something beautiful, we take a minute. There's a sigh, we inhale, and then there's an exhale. Aries does not permit this. And then when we take this in the realm of relationship, which is the realm of Venus, attach these 2 words together, quick relationships, instant gratification from connections. So Venus has to become thrill-oriented in relationship rather than trying to build something and sustain it. That loyalty and fidelity that's related to Venus. So it's constantly just chasing new experiences. That's the script that Venus has got. That's what it's got to do in the sign of Aries. Aries doesn't give it that enduring and cultivating space. It's just like, grow now, do now, just go get the crop. Don't worry about it. Doesn't have to grow. Just go get another one. That's the kind of feeling that Venus gets in the sign of Aries. And then Venus and Aries can jump into relationships super quickly without evaluating anything, like consequences of what does it mean to be with this person. Act now, think later will become the motto. So the pattern that this creates is that the person falls in love super quickly and then they fall out of love very fast too. The passion just fizzles out. It's full on, that burst, that sprint of I'm all in, and then I am all out. I need to rest. I need to sit. I can't do this. So in some ways, we could say Venus becomes a little bit impulsive when it comes to relationships. And like all planets, I say this in many videos, we live and learn. It doesn't mean because you have the signature in your charts or by transit right now that this is our lot forever. It's just, these are the things that a person comes to experience. Going back to that Gundanta point or the critical degree, the knots that a person needs to unknot and untie in this life are related to these kinds of modes and ways of being. Here, the person's supposed to learn, how do you actually establish deep connections? Like, take that passion that's in Aries and take the qualities that are in Venus and make this a sustainable passion towards the same person, for example. I'll talk more about this, about the kind of life lessons that comes out of Venus with Aries towards the end of the episode. Another thing that can happen with Venus and Aries in the context of relationships is that Venus naturally can consider the emotions and the needs of other people. This is what the feminine and the receptive planets can do. But in this very self-oriented sign, it's hard for it to prioritize other people's needs. So we know this usually leads to relationship conflicts. So having heated, conflictual relationships can be part of the experiences of a Venus in Aries. Another thing, Aries can have a very competitive edge to it. You bring this into a relationship, you're asking for trouble because relationships are supposed to be about cooperation. It's not one man up ship of how I can do things better than you. It's very irritating being with someone like that in a relationship. You just can't feel comfortable. Venus in Aries is creating that kind of a discomfort for itself and for their partner. And naturally, Venus prefers to cooperate, not to compete. But here it is in the sign of Aries. And in a lot of ways, this weird drive that can be in the sign of Aries exhausts Venus, exhausts love, exhausts relationships. It creates discontent, disconnection. And I was saying the ruler of the sign of Aries is Mars. Mars is very happy with disconnecting things because now it freed it from the previous bonding or the way that it was bound. So now it's free to move to the next destination. That's not what Venus wants to do. But Mars wants that. And the sign of Mars, which is Aries, accommodates this. And Venus in Aries people could also have their own script based on the rest of the chart in terms of how a relationship should be like or how fast it should move. And then if someone moves off that kind of a script, they'll disconnect. They'll sever that relationship and their ties to it. Or if someone else is trying to impinge on their individuality, like this is what a partner ought to be, and a Venus in Aries is like, who are you to dictate to me? It's over right there and then. It's got that kind of a feel to it. But let's for a second talk about a few points where we could say once when one has learned, Venus can do some spectacularly cool stuff in the sign of Aries. For example, one of them is because the sign of Aries represents bravery. A lot of people are fearful of love. So Venus here can have a sense of courage about loving. I mean, it might have gone through 10 relationships that cause it hurt, but it still has that courage to have another person to love again. This is an important thing in life, not to become discouraged by the hurts that relationship and love can bring about. So in a lot of ways, Venus is willing to make emotional risks, is willing to actively pursue and to attain love. So yes, Venus naturally likes to be passive, but this is also an important aspect in life to have the courage to be vulnerable again. Because a lot of times in coming to love someone, we have to make ourselves vulnerable. So this is one point. Another thing, the sign of Aries is about passion. Venus has to do about creativity. We know with a lot of creatives, the furnace behind them is passion. A lot of times when you ask someone, why do you write? Why do you paint? Why do you make music? They don't really have an answer. It's just an urge, it's an inner urge and a passion that's driving them to pursue these creative endeavors. So when you have Venus in the sign of Aries, because of that passion and because of the creativity and the skills that come with it, they can be complementary in a lot of ways. And you know, Venus will take the script of Aries, and Venus is like, I'm enduring. I'm about fidelity. The sign is crazy. Like, it's kind of warlike. Venus is feeling the aggression. So Venus is like, okay, how can I take some things about myself and implement it here in this act, in this role? So in relationships, if Venus wants to enact that enduring factor that it has, it becomes a kind of that saying, or of a ride or die kind of a partner. It's got that kind of a mentality when it wants to sustain relationship, and it injects that passion behind it. So it's just going to meet all kinds of challenges in a relationship head on, very boldly. It's just unwavering about what it will do for its partner, for better or for worse, Bonnie and Clyde type of a situation. And in some ways here, the passion is just burning constantly. So that Aries factor is fueling Venus to love under all kinds of situations that normally seem strange or difficult. Another thing about Venus in Aries that's very cool, because this is an individualistic sign, so it's going to express itself as an individual, and Venus has to do with beauty and creativity. This person can have a very unique self-expression about their individual person and who they are. And they can bring that uniqueness, which is actually a kind of it's very authentic. It's very raw. They can bring that into a relationship too. What you see is also what you get. You can get this kind of a feel. They have an edge to them, Venus in Aries. And another thing is that when they are in relationships, you better not be wanting to plagiarize their sense of self, like who they are as an individual. And the beauty of it here is that they are also willing participants to kind of let you be you. And that they do that because they don't want you to infringe on their sense of individuality, because they want that freedom to be who they are and how they need to express themselves. And you inject a little bit of maturity with this over a lifetime. This is a Venus that knows how to uphold, honor, and respect what their partners like in their full, authentic sense of self. They're not trying to dictate to the other person in terms of how they ought to be. And generally this starts because they start to learn very early on, hey, I gotta let other people be them if I want to be myself. Because if I start enforcing this rule of how they ought to be, they're going to start doing that back to me. And I just can't deal with that. So this is actually a very cool thing that comes out of Venus in Aries, and especially over a lifetime when it gets a sense of maturity. It's very empowering for both people in a relationship to have this kind of a concept. They can just be their full, authentic self. Now we come to that. We have to discuss this in terms of the interaction of water and fire, because the element of Venus is water and the element of the sign of Aries is fires.